Good evening, viewers. This is Riaz Ajiz, and the program is Journalist Insight. Today, I have with me Dan Shelley. He is the Executive Director of Radio, TV, Digital News Association in America. I am going to ask many questions regarding journalistic approaches and journalistic professionalism in America or also around the world. Thank you very much, Shelley. You give us time. So,
Thanks for.
first of all, we'd like to know uh, how did you start your journalistic career and where did you work?
I started as a radio reporter in the Midwest of the United States and worked in a very small radio market and then moved to a larger market before eventually moving to New York City, where I worked for a time for CBS television stations. And from there went to another couple of radio companies, including iHeartMedia, before becoming executive director of RTD&A. I was a long-time, nearly 20-year member of the board of directors, and when the previous executive director retired, I decided this would be a nice next move for my career.
Where are you from? Are you Native American?
Yes, I'm Native American from the Midwest here in the United States.
And how long your journalistic career is?
I started when I was in college in 1980, so I've been in journalism in one form or another for 38 years.
You opt journalism or you were thrown by your fate to this profession?
I would say I was drawn by fate to this profession. Um, I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be in radio and perhaps television. At first, I thought I wanted to be a disc jockey, but a very wise advisor when I was in high school told me that I did not want to be a disc jockey, that I wanted to be a journalist, because journalists, when they get old, he said at the time, all those years ago, are considered statesmen. And everyone forgets about disc jockeys after they retire. And so that piece of advice that I received at a very young age, while still in high school, changed my life, and I immediately pivoted my studies toward journalism and have had a very nice career in journalism, as I said, for 38 years now and counting.
Where did you enjoy more? I mean, it is in television or radio?
I would say radio is my first love, and the work I did in at CBS Television was in the digital business unit of CBS television stations, where I helped launch and grow the digital business for all of the CBS-owned television stations across the country.
So you think radio is better for you, and you enjoyed more in radio?
Radio gives you a lot of freedom. Television obviously is a very powerful medium, but radio, I like to believe, is a more intimate medium because people can take radios with them wherever they go. They can have them in any room in their home, and something about a spoken word. And there's a saying about radio in the United States. Radio is theater of the mind. So if you can paint a good picture with your words as a radio correspondent, then people can use their own imaginations to picture what actually is happening that you're describing. I think it provides a lot more freedom as a journalist and is, as I said, a much more intimate medium.
Then in Pakistan, we see radio is very weak medium, has become very weak medium because people are not interested in radio and they try to watch television. I want to ask you, in America, what radio importance has up till now?
Radio has gone through a tremendous amount of change as an industry in the 38 years that I have been in media. It started out much more powerful than it is today in terms of journalism. Radio is still extremely powerful. It still reaches more homes than television in the United States. However, there's not quite as much journalism occurring on the radio today, generally speaking, in the United States, as there was when I started. There are a number of notable exceptions, a number of very strong and very powerful and very profitable all news stations and news talk stations, but not as many as there used to be.
Okay, journalism in America, at what standard is it is standing right now when you are doing journalism and the new generation is also coming and new journalists are coming? What is the difference between you, what you were doing in the journalism and the coming generation in America?
Well, there's several differences, chief among them technology. Here in the United States, most young people today get their news and information from smartphones and tablets and computers. And they're on platforms such as Snapchat and Instagram and not so much Facebook, as that tends to skew a little older in terms of the people who tend to use Facebook more. But social media has become extremely important to the younger generation. And what I call the legacy media, the traditional radio and television companies that operate here in the United States, are adapting to present their news and information that they gather on those new platforms to ensure that they remain viable well into the future as the current young generation grows older.
I mean to say, generation having professional approaches like you in your time, it was something very different, and the journalistic approaches were different, and also the investigative reporting was different. Now, what do you think? What standard they are adopting?
I think investigative reporting, for starters, is actually much better today than it was when I started. You have a lot of the companies that own television stations, for example, and some radio stations in the United States that are really making significant investments in beefing up or enhancing their investigative reporting units. And I think that's a very positive development, because when a local television station, for example, does an investigative report that exposes a problem in the community it serves, it often serves as a catalyst for change, for positive change in that community. So investigative reporting is becoming much more prevalent and much more important in the United States today than even when I started all those years ago.
Here in Pakistan, we see a problem that the juniors who are coming in this profession, they do not respect seniors. What scenario is in America?
Well, I'm heartened by the fact that journalism schools, colleges and universities in the United States that teach young people how to become journalists are seeing a significant increase in enrollment. And I think that bodes very well for the future of journalism in the United States, because more and more young people are getting into the field of journalism. They may conduct that journalism on platforms that don't exist today. They may not go into television or radio, but they may go into journalism on platforms we don't even have any idea what they are yet, but we are seeing an influx of young people entering the journalism field, and I think that's a very positive development.
No,
here in America.
this was not my question. My question was, youngsters are coming in this field, and they do not think this journalist is this much senior from me, and I must respect him or her. He is just taking as granted the seniors. This is happening in Pakistan. Is it happening in America?
No, it's not actually. While a lot of new journalists who are entering the field in America may look at traditional television or traditional radio with some degree of disrespect, The elder journalists are widely respected by the new people who are entering the field, because those new people realize that the older journalists, the more experienced journalists, have a lot to teach them, and they can learn a lot from them, and there tends to be respect in that regard.
Okay, in poor countries or developing countries, the standard of journalism is not this much high as it is in America or in Western world. What I mean steps we should take to upgrade the standard of journalism in poor countries or the developing countries like Pakistan?
I would say, remember, first and foremost, if you are a journalist, you are there to serve the public. You are there to inform the public. You are there to speak truth to power. You are there to hold the powerful accountable. You are there to expose problems in communities, large and small. You exist to create a more informed and educated society. You really are performing a vital public service on behalf of the audiences that you serve. And I would urge journalists in all countries around the world, developing countries, poor countries, and even rich industrialized countries, never to forget what their role in society is, and that is to create a more informed and educated society.
This is very important. What I want to know from your side that in journalism there are very different ways, and people are coming from different sects of the society. Uh, if journalists are carrying any political agenda, what do you say about that, journalists or association of journalists?
Well, we have a problem here in America of what I call the conflation or the confusion on the part of many members of the public here between journalism, the act of seeking and reporting the truth, and opinion media, commentators who and analysts who opine on the events of the day from their particular point of view, often politically or ideologically motivated, or both. And I think it is very important all around the world, and obviously here in the United States, that news organizations and media companies clearly define for the audience the difference between journalism and opinion. And I fear that in other countries around the world, that to the degree that you have not yet experienced that, you will, as media continues to go through its natural evolution, and I worry about that.
I have just interviewed many international journalists and war correspondents. They make a complaint against the Western media that it becomes biased when the national interest comes, in matter of national interest come. What do you say about that?
I say they have a point, and it speaks to what I was just saying. The media, particularly the national cable news channels here in the United States, some of which are seen in other countries, but many are not. Um, they are in many cases responsible for this conflation or confusion between real journalism and opinion media. And I think that is a definite problem that we as American journalists have to work on.
So you admit it, American and the Western media becomes biased when the matter of national interest come.
I think you have to make a distinction between journalists and analysts, or those engaged in opinion media. The journalists in the United States, by and large, are doing a responsible job of seeking and reporting the truth. Or as famous American journalist Carl Bernstein calls it, the best obtainable version of the truth. Uh, but if you're a cable network, for example, here in America, and you air a report from a journalist and put that journalist on a panel with opinion media personalities, it's very easy for the public to confuse what is journalism, what are the facts, and what are the opinion media personalities' take on the facts or viewpoint on the facts.
Okay, let
And I
me
think that is
let me ask a question in the same context. In Iraq, when the Saddam Hussein regime was there, it was blamed that it has biological weapons, and none of the Western media refused this news. And later on, we came to know that the news was wrong and the reality was different. So, what would you say about it?
well, that was a very different and unique time here in the act a couple of years prior to that by Al Qaeda. We had gone through a tremendous amount of national emotional trauma and physical trauma. And I do think, and other journalists have said this as well, I do think that in this very patriotic fervor that emerged following the 9/11 attacks, that some journalists, many journalists, if not most journalists, did take at face value whatever the United States government said about Iraq or any other perceived enemy. And there wasn't enough. There was some, but there wasn't enough in retrospect. Tough questioning and skepticism among journalists about what the Bush administration was saying relative to chemical weapons and biological weapons in Iraq and other perceived countries, other perceived enemies, countries that were perceived as enemies at that time. I think we've learned lessons from that. I don't think we'll see that again in the future. But I am not alone among American journalists in feeling that in the post 9/11 patriotic fervor that existed here in the United States, we made some mistakes.
Now it is also happening. I must give you the example. Yesterday I interviewed a Syrian journalist. He is the president, rather general secretary of the Syrian Journalists Association. He blamed that Western media has become biased in Syrian position and Syrian situation. So same is happening. It like it happened in Iraq, and same is happening in Syria and also in other countries where America is involved in wars.
Well, not having been privy to the conversation that you had with the Syrian journalist, and I respect that person's point of view, I would respectfully disagree with it, and say that by and large, from where I sit, from my perspective, Western journalists are doing a responsible job of reporting on the conflict in Syria, and all of the aspects that are involved there, the civil war that's been going on, the Russian intervention, the American use of force in Syria, the ISIL pockets that continue to wreak havoc in parts of Syria, the evacuation of the White Helmets, and the other humanitarians that are in
No,
grave
no,
danger there.
I'm not getting the answer of my question. I must repeat it and should elaborate my question more. I want to ask you, when the two countries are fighting against each other and the two big powers are in the game, so big powers are playing the role in that area, along with the media. Media is also standing with their countries. Is it not true? You think?
I think the American media, as it relates specifically to the ongoing conflict in Syria, is doing the best job that it can in reporting to the American people what its government, what the U.S. government is doing in Syria and what is occurring in Syria. I would respectfully disagree with the notion that we are somehow puppets of our government and supportive of what our government, or for that matter, not supportive of our government. We are the journalists, the American and Western journalists who are risking their lives reporting from Syria, are doing so to inform the rest of the world, particularly the United States in our case, about what is occurring there. And we have, to use a Midwestern American expression. We have no dog in that hunt. We're there to report the facts as we see them, and the facts as we are able to discern them from the people who are there, both Americans and other involved parties.
In case of Osama bin Laden, in case of Taliban, in case of ISIS, it is just an impression is in the Eastern world that these all factors were made or established by America. But the media, I mean, Western media, especially American media, does not reflect such type of things. What do you comment on it?
Well, I would say that from a journalistic perspective, we try to report as many sides of the story, any story, as we can find. There are more than two sides to every story. Uh, yes, we were attacked on 9/11. Yes, our government retaliated. Uh, in the vacuum that was created after we left, after U.S. forces, not journalists, but U.S. troops, uh, began to leave Iraq and Afghanistan. The Taliban was able to get another foothold, and we report those stories as we see them. We don't approach those stories from a purely American perspective, meaning blindly cheering on our government's action. I think we learned some very important lessons at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, uh, specifically that we can't necessarily take at face value what our government is telling us about the folks that they say are our enemies. We have to investigate, and we have to tell all sides of the story as best we can.
But generally, it's not happening.
Well, I would disagree. Perhaps from the perspective of a lot of journalists in your country and in nearby countries, they don't see all of the journalism that is occurring here in the United States and in the West. But I would respectfully disagree that we're not doing a thorough job of covering stories in your part of the world.
One thing is also very important. In general scenario, I'm talking. Uh, what is the meaning if you are saying means your vision, your thinkings are very clear about the journalism, and your answers are very clear. They are loudly speaking about your visions. But in the association which you are running, and you are the executive director of that association, every journalist think like that.
Well, I speak for the broadcast and digital journalism industry in the United States. I don't, uh, and there's a broad uh, spectrum of points of view among the journalists I represent as to what our role is in society. But one thing we all have in common is that we believe our role in society is an educated public. And that is how I would answer your question. We, as an association, do our best to help broadcast and digital journalists in America and in many other countries around the world seek and report the truth in a responsible and ethical manner.
Okay, if you find a journalist having some political agenda or having some extremist lines, what do you do with that journalist?
We speak out about that journalist. If someone is who claims to be a journalist is knowingly spreading false information, conspiracy theories, etc., we speak out and we call them out and we denounce them for that.
Do you arrange trainings for the journalists, for new journalists especially, to go on the same line as you are speaking out as your thing?
Yes, we do workshops uh, throughout the year all across the United States for entry level journalists and for mid level journalists and even for senior journalists, trying to help them be better at their craft and trying to help them make ethical decisions. Often journalists in America and around the world face real tough ethical dilemmas, and it's a hard process to work through some of those dilemmas to make sure that you're reporting the news in a responsible way. And we have a code of ethics. We have coverage guidelines that offer advice and training to journalists at all levels on how to handle difficult ethical and other situations.
Your training programs are only for American journalists, not from other countries' journalists.
No, anyone is welcome to participate. You can learn more about some of our training programs and resources at rtdna.org. And we welcome any journalist from anywhere in the world to participate.
And the expenses, how will meet?
I'm sorry?
The expenses, who will meet the expenses? The association will bear the expenses?
If you're a member of our association, all of our training, most of our training is free. We do in-person workshops around the country, and there's a nominal fee for that. But anything we do online, there's just a nominal fee of a few dollars to participate in the online trainings that we do throughout the year.
Okay, how many members you have in your association?
We have about 1,200 members. Mostly from the United States and Canada, but we're also represented by members on virtually every continent in the world except Antarctica. There are at least a handful of journalists in every continent who belong to or are part of our association.
If a person who is a journalist, in a cover of journalist, he is an agent of any spy or any security agency, he is working in the cover of journalist, do you find such type of journalists around you?
Generally, no. I have had inquiries from news organizations, supposed news organizations, that are widely recognized to be part of a particular nation's government and are not independent journalists. And I have discouraged their membership in our association and their participation in our programs. We're not a regulatory agency. We don't license journalists. We don't accredit journalists. We encourage journalists to be better at what they do and more ethical at what they do. And if someone inquires about a membership from a known government-run news organization, particularly from a government that is hostile toward the United States, we strongly discourage their membership in our association.
Okay, standard of journalism I was just talking about, and you gave many answers. I recalled one question in the same contest. WikiLeaks came a few years back. What do you think? It is journalism?
I think, no, I don't think it's journalism. I think WikiLeaks is a conduit of information, leaked information or secret information that our government or someone else has determined should not be in the public domain. I don't consider that a form of traditional journalism. However, we have in America, as you know, the First Amendment, which gives everyone the right to freedom of the press and freedom of speech. We have the First Amendment to our Constitution, which guarantees freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and we support the First Amendment, all aspects of it. We support the right of WikiLeaks and others to disseminate information, but when an outlet such as WikiLeaks does so with a political motivation, that really doesn't fall into the same category as what a traditional journalist would do.
So you don't call that journalism?
I suppose in a broad sense, you would have to consider it journalism. In my personal opinion, it's not journalism, it's the leaking of information.
And
that
what do you
many
say?
times
Okay,
that
what do you say
that
about Panama Papers? Same.
same thing. Now, I will say this about WikiLeaks, about Panama Papers, and about other organizations that spread classified or otherwise secret information. That once they share that information, it is the responsibility of journalists to make a decision as to whether or not we publish or broadcast the information leaked by those organizations. And in many cases, journalists have done so.
Okay, Mr. Dan, time is over, and I have only two questions to ask more. I must ask, I had to ask many questions, but the time is no more. So, this is my second last question. What do you understand with the criteria of that freedom of expression? What do you mean by that, and do you think freedom of expressions have some boundaries?
Yes, they definitely have boundaries. The First Amendment to our Constitution guarantees every American the right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but that doesn't mean that you can say anything you want and not necessarily expect repercussions from what you do. I mean, the highest court in America, the U.S. Supreme Court, has consistently ruled throughout the decades, particularly since the early 20th century, that there are limits to free speech.
I just interviewed Danish journalists last 2 days ago, and I asked this question regarding the cartoon they were published. He supported that view. Do you support that such type of cartoons may be published in a paper which hurts billions of people?
It depends on the cartoon. There's a rather well-known case here in America. Uh, a cartoonist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was publishing cartoons that were critical of President Trump. The publisher of that newspaper is a supporter of President Trump, and so he uh, fired the cartoonist, and we stood up for the cartoonist because he has a First Amendment right uh, to draw cartoons that are critical of any president, whether it's President Trump or any president we have had or will have. But cartoons that openly advocate violence, I think, are improper and are not really journalism. They're
The
propaganda.
cartoons were against any religion or the religion faiths. Do you support that type of cartoons may be published, or if a cartoonist publish this type of cartoon, will you support that journalist?
I think it depends on the cartoon and it depends on what the actual message is. I would have to make that decision on a case by case basis. I know that many religions are highly offended when cartoons are published that are critical of their religion or their religious leaders. And I also know that lives have been lost and lives have been endangered by merely by publishing such cartoons.
Uh,
But as they
I'm talking about. Let me clear it. I'm talking about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. Uh, Cartoon about this cartoon was reflecting Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was a prophet. So freedom of expression allows anybody to publish a cartoon which is relating to any religious faiths, and it is hurting billions of people around the globe, and which is creating violence in the country.
well, I condemn all violence, particularly against journalists, but against anyone else. I also think that journalists have a responsibility, be they editorial cartoonists, be they reporters, be they editors. They have a responsibility to be sensitive to particular religious or other concerns that are deeply and legitimately held by some. And I think while I condemn violence in any fashion, particularly against journalists or editorial cartoonists, I do think that journalists and cartoonists have a responsibility to show sensitivity to certain groups of people. For example, in America, it is very uh, offensive to draw an editorial cartoon that depicts black people in unflattering ways. So we have faced that same conundrum on a different level in a different area. But I condemn uh, any violence against anyone, particularly a journalist or an editorial cartoonist.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dan Chale. You gave us time. It's been very good interview and very informative, and you responded all the questions very openly. I thank you very much and pay your thanks once again, and hope we shall be in contact in future.
Likewise, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.